friends! In this video we're going to go over some of the basic to-dos for preparing yourself to apply to medical school at the beginning of the semester prior to applying. So broken down, the primary application consists of basic information, stats, essays, letters of recommendation, and your school list. After submitting the primary application, most schools will send out secondary applications to complete, but the details around those are covered in other videos, so go check those out if you need to. Since the basic information is unlikely to change, and your school list should be shaped by your stats and experiences, I'm going to focus on the sections more immediately within your control to work on the semester prior to applying, which are the stats, which consist of your transcripts, grades, and your AMCAS scores, your extracurriculars, which will be described in the works and activities section of your essays, and your letters of recommendation. So first, the stats. The first thing we need to do in general is to assess whether or not we're ready to apply. I have another video that goes into detail on how to assess your stats and extracurriculars for competitiveness, but in general, if you haven't already, you need to calculate your AMCAS GPA. If it's too low to be competitive, that's worth knowing as soon as possible so that you can plan whether and how to readjust your timeline. It's worth noting that your AMCAS application for MD schools and AACOMAS application for DO schools will calculate your GPA to factor in every higher institution class and grade you've ever received. So every F and D will be factored in, every withdrawal will be noted, and every retaking course will be averaged with the first grade you received for that class. The GPA you graduate with on your transcript may not be the GPA that appears on your AMCAS or AACOMAS application, and that's worth knowing ahead of time in case it's necessary to readjust your timeline. If you feel comfortable with where your cumulative AMCAS GPA is, or where it's projected to go over the next semester, and you still haven't taken your MCAT yet, figure out when you're going to do that and strategize your study plan. Make sure when you do this, you budget in time to maintain your GPA if that's applicable for you, maintain your extracurriculars, and write your application essays. If you already have an MCAT, next is to assess whether or not your GPA and MCAT combination puts you in a range of probability for acceptance that you're comfortable with. How do you determine this? This is a breakdown of the combinations of stats that applicants and accepted applicants had between 2020 through 2023. Along the side, applicants are categorized by their cumulative total GPA. Along the top, applicants are categorized by the range their most recent MCAT score fell into. In the bottom right-hand corner, we see that of everyone who applied, only 41% of applicants gained an acceptance. But I want to break the numbers down a little for a second. In this version, green is everything above 40%, so these combinations are either as favorable or more favorable than the quote-unquote average applicant. Everything between 30 and 40% is highlighted in orange, where the odds were not quite as favorable, but likely with compelling experiences, people made it happen. And then I didn't bother highlighting below 30%. I do want to emphasize though that stats most certainly aren't everything, and even those with lower combinations of stats gained admissions in numerous cases. There are other factors, like science GPA, upward trends, post-bac work, and graduate level GPAs that are also taken into account by admissions committees. And in cases where post-bac work or special master's programs need to be taken into account, I would even argue that this chart is significantly less relevant to you. However, I wanted to show this graph to highlight how dramatically your odds of acceptance can be influenced by your GPA and MCAT scores. So next, if you're comfortable with where your AMCAS GPA and MCAT combinations stand, my next recommendation is purchasing MSAR. MSAR is the Medical School Admissions Requirements Report published by the AMC and is absolutely invaluable in narrowing down your school list. And is relatively cheap. It's about $28 for access for 1 year and about $36 to access for 2 years. In addition to the median, MSAR allows you to see MD schools' 10th, 25th, 75th, and 90th percentile ranges for GPA and MCAT for their most recently accepted class. Making a school list, like preparing to apply, should factor in more than just stats. But without those stats, it's a lot harder to get in the door for an interview, so it's at least worth knowing where you stand with some of your favorite or target schools. Just in general, even if you have a strong GPA, admissions committees will look at GPA trends, so try to maintain that if you can. And then, at the end of every semester until maybe 3 or 4 months prior to the application submission date, which should be June for most of you, you should be on the lookout for who could potentially be a good letter of recommendation writer for your application. We'll circle back in a second on how to identify good letter of rec writers. But in the meantime, let's address what you can be doing in advance to prepare your essay section, much of which will consist of your discussions on your extracurricular activities in the works and activities section. Regarding the works and activities, so firstly, you need to know where you stand. So log approximately how many hours you have in each of the high yield categories. But wait, what are the categories? On AMCAS, you get 15 slots and 700 characters for each of those slots. And then 3 of those 15 slots can be designated as most meaningful experiences, where you get an additional 1,325 characters. Each slot must be categorized in one of the 19 categories you can choose from, with the more commonly used categories bolded. AACOMAS, on the other hand, the application for DO schools, has an unlimited number of slots, but you get 600 characters instead of 700 characters. And the categories of activities fall into 2 major categories of either experiences or achievements. Which categories matter more? This table comes from a 2023 survey of 128 MD schools who were asked how important were the following data about academic preparation, experiences, attributes, and personal competencies competencies, bio and demographic characteristics, and interview results in identifying the applicants to interview or offer an acceptance, though I'm currently only showing the experiences section. Each factor was rated on a scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being not important and 4 being very important, and the average importance rating was calculated and the factors were organized and listed in order of mean importance rating. In order of highest to lowest mean importance rating, in the high importance rating section, we see clinical volunteering, non-clinical volunteering, shadowing, leadership, paid clinical employment, and I think it's worth noting that research is the next highest rated factor, although it didn't quite make the high importance rated category. And the data from that survey pretty decently aligns with the acceptance data from the matriculants questionnaire, showing that of the applicants across 3 years who received at least one acceptance, almost 95% shadowed a physician or other healthcare professional, around 91% volunteered in a healthcare setting, around 88% volunteered in a non-healthcare setting, and around 58% reported participating in research during undergrad. Once you've logged an approximation of how many hours you've had in each of the high yield categories, we next need to determine whether or not we're short in any of these categories and plan how we're going to get those hours up to par by the time of application. Well, wait, how do I know if I'm short on hours? How many hours are enough? Again, I cover this a bit more in depth in the video on assessing whether or not you're ready to apply, but to recap, you'll want at least 100 hours of clinical work, either paid or volunteer, 100 hours of non-clinical volunteer work, close to 100 hours or more of shadowing if you're struggling for clinical hours, but you can get away with a bit less if you have high clinical hours, and ideally enough research to be able to speak meaningfully to the research question you're trying to answer, the methods by which you're trying to answer them, how to interpret the results if you have any, and any conclusions you can safely come to if you have any results. It's worth noting that these are minimum hours to get past screening, not minimum hours to be competitive. Competitive applicants generally have numbers greatly exceeding these in at least one or more of the categories. It's also worth knowing that you can project hours on your application for what you're planning to accomplish during your application year, but these hours will not be weighed nearly as heavily as hours you've already completed. So for that reason, I suggest that your projected hours not be factored into the minimum hours needed to get past screening. But again, it's worth remembering that it's not just about the hours you put in. It's about what you contribute to your community and your environment and learn from the experience. You're going to need to have about 600 to 700 characters worth of content to write about what you learned and how you contributed to these activities come application time. So I recommend jotting down a few notes whenever it's relevant during the experiences on meaningful contributions you made, meaningful interactions that had an impact on you or where you had an impact on someone else, or any lessons you learned about yourself, healthcare, being a physician, or serving others. At least 2 to 3 months before date of application submission, you'll want to identify letter writers and request letters of recommendation. And again, we'll circle back to letters of recommendation in a second. But lastly, at least prior to submission, make sure you have the organization's contact information. When filling out the application's works and activities section, you're going to need a contact name and title, the contact's email and phone number, the organization's name, and the location of the organization. These are just needed prior to submission of the application though, so make sure you have them by the time you need to submit. So finally, we circle back to the letters of recommendation. Before we get too deep in the weeds on letters of rec, the first thing we need to address is the question of whether or not your school supplies a committee letter. A committee letter can come in a couple different forms, but oftentimes the committee letter highlights the greatest strengths of each of your individual letters that you submit to your pre-health or pre-med committee, who will summarize these letters and emphasize certain aspects about you as an applicant. If your school doesn't provide one, just ignore me on this slide. But if your school does provide them, while it's not a hard requirement, it's generally expected that you have one when applying. Note that the process for attaining your committee letter will be specific to the institution you attended, and depending on the school, that can take several months of preparation. It is absolutely in your best interest to find out if your school has one, and if they do, what their requirements are, like if they have a GPA or MCAT minimum requirement, hours of certain extracurriculars requirements, drafts of your applications ready, an application for the committee letter itself, or an interview process to obtain the committee letter. It's also worth noting that there can be several good reasons to not have a committee letter, but if you don't have one and your school does provide one, be prepared to explain. So if your school doesn't provide a committee letter, and you're providing individual letters or a letter packet, what letters do you need? So the requirements on letters of recommendation will vary for each medical school that you apply to, but the 5 major letters that will cover the requirements for almost every school: 2 science academic letters, so professors who taught you in a science class, 1 non-science academic letter, so any professor who's taught you any non-science course. You can potentially get away with professors who taught you a non-biochem, physics, or math class, but you need to clarify that with the school. 1 physician letter, a huge number of DO schools will ask for a physician letter, and a small handful of schools will ask for specifically a DO physician letter, so find out in advance if the school that you're targeting needs a DO physician letter or just any physician letter. And 1 non-clinical letter. Ideally, your non-clinical letter can come from the principal investigator that you had for research, or any contacts you listed or supervisors that you had for any of your most meaningful experiences. Ideally, all your letters of recommendation are either good to positively glowing about you. Any hint of negativity in a letter of recommendation can sour an admissions committee's perspective of you and unintentionally bias them against other aspects of your application. So how do we identify who will be a good letter of recommendation writer? When looking for who to ask to write write you a letter of recommendation, you want to take some major things into consideration. Like, does this professor or supervisor actually know my face and name? If not, do not ask them. Can they speak meaningfully to my work ethic or my character? And to what extent? And then lastly, when requesting your letter of recommendation, you need to directly and explicitly ask, would you be able and willing to write me a strong letter of recommendation for medical school? The person will answer you honestly. If they say they can't, thank them for their time and walk away. Every letter of recommendation needs to give off as positive an impression as possible. If they are lackluster about their support, that will show in their writing. Generally speaking, I would request these letters of recommendation in person if possible, and then ask if they would like a follow-up email confirming their commitment to writing you a letter of recommendation. This gives both of you written reminders of what is needed from both ends. So this is the general format template that I use to request my letters of recommendation. So introduction with a proper title, explicitly state what you're requesting, establish how you know them and why they were influential to you, and why their support would be meaningful to you, though this isn't as necessary if you already asked in person and they agreed, instructions on when and how to submit the letter of recommendation, and offer any materials you currently have to help them write the letter of recommendation, and then a nice thank you. Wait, rewind. Offer materials that could help them write a strong letter of recommendation? Like what? I'm so glad you asked. It's not uncommon for letter writers to want a few more details or more context about you, your work history, your story, or your drive to be able to write with a little bit more substance. Some letter writers might also ask for materials that other letter writers might not, so it's always good to be prepared with things like an updated resume or CV, your updated transcripts. Some letter writers might want a draft of your personal statement or a draft of the works and activities entry that you have on whatever experience you had with them, though this shouldn't be necessary to have on hand at the time of requesting the letter, unless you're requesting the letter on relatively short notice. Some letter writers might not be super familiar with writing letters of recommendation, or writing letters of recommendation for specifically medical school, so having the AMCAS guidelines on how to write letters of rec attached in your email can often be helpful. It's also worth noting that some letter writers may either be so lost on the letter writing process or so busy and crunched for time that they ask you to write an outline of what you'd like them to highlight or write up a first draft of their letter for them. This one is also a little less common though, so it's not necessary to have this one prepared in advance unless they specifically ask for it. Note that for those of you who have committee letters, this slide might not apply to you, and the committee letter may have their own timeline that they need you to follow. But for everyone else, this is the general timeline that I followed and recommend following when it comes to requesting letters of recommendation. Especially if your letter of recommendation writer is a professor, they're often very busy, and things often fall through the cracks. Checking in at multiple points helps keep you on their radar and plan ahead if you need to substitute their letter out with someone else's. So I recommend checking in at least one semester in advance prior to applying, again in the January of the year that you plan to apply. So for those of you applying to matriculate in the fall of 2025 who will be applying in the spring or summer of 2024, that means checking in January of 2024, again about 2 months prior to submission, and this is the latest you should be getting your letter writers any additional materials that they requested in my opinion, and then again 2 to 3 weeks prior to submission if your letter writer hasn't submitted already, which your AMCAS or AACOMAS portal should notify you of an upload. As the time of early submission approaches, you'll want to start actually writing your essays, like your personal statement, your works and activities, and your other impactful experiences essay if that's relevant to you. And I have other videos covering how to go about these essays on my channel. Note that these are just my recommendations and there are multiple ways to successfully apply. This approach just saves a lot of time and stress down the road. So I hope this was helpful to you. Leave a comment if you have any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.